Today, I want to continue our series, Because I Love My Church. The local church is the hope of the world because we're the ones God has given the only message that can change someone's eternity. And as a result, we should love the church. And if we love the church, there are 8 actions that we should take. And that's what we're looking at in this series. We've already seen 3 of them. We saw week number 1 that because I love my church, I will share courageously. Week number 2, because I love my church, I will give generously. Week number 3, because I love my church, I will serve faithfully. And today we're going to add a 4th element to it. Because I love my church, I will pray fervently. Nothing of eternal importance happens apart from prayer. So today, I want to look at the prayer life of one individual in the Bible. A story in the Old Testament. That for some reason, these kind of stories have been regulated to children's ministry. You know, we tell these stories in kids' ministry. But very rarely do we preach on it to the big kids. And this is one of those stories. It's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of you in the Gospel Center, down in the chapel, at our Sioux campus, and watching online, you can respond by hitting the heart button. How many of you have ever heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den? Raise your hand. All right, that's almost all of you. Okay, put your hands down. Let me ask it again. How many of you, in all of our campuses, even online, how many of you have heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den at least 10 times? Raise your hand. Yeah, that's most of you. All right, let me ask one more. How many of you in the Gospel Center, down at the chapel, at our Sioux campus, watching online by hitting the heart button, how many of you have ever heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den told with a flannel graph presentation? Yeah, aren't those the coolest things? See, some of you are going, what's a flannel graph? What is that? And if you're saying that, you have been deprived spiritually, okay? Because I don't think any modern element today comes close to how cool flannel graphs were. And most of us, if you grew up in church and you're about my age or older, you probably saw Daniel in the lion's den presented via the flannel graph. That's cool. I'm not going to do that today, but that's cool right there. And so today we're going to look at this story. And from this story, I want to identify 8 characteristics of Daniel's prayer life. We're going to go through them quick. You can write them down in the notes in your outline. If you're watching online, you can click on notes. It'll be right there for you. And what I want to do is to give you these 8 characteristics and ask you, which one of these 8, not all 8 of them, just which one of these 8 can you grab hold of this morning to apply to your life this week to pray more fervently? Now, as I begin, though, let me kind of set it all up. Let me read Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse number 1. Let me kind of give you a setup to what's going on. Daniel is right now living under the Persian king, King Darius. Daniel is in that region because he was taken captive earlier by the Babylonians. Since then, the Persians have taken over the Babylonians, and now they have a new king. So look what it says. It seemed good to Darius, he's the Persian king at the time, to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over those 120, there would be 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one of the 3. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned, note this, to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Now let me set up what's going on as we talk for a moment about the person of Daniel. Now keep in mind that Daniel at this time is in his 80s. He is, by all accounts, an old man. Now, keep in mind that when Daniel was first brought to the kingdom, he was only a teenager. Remember, the Babylonians took over Israel. They took the young men captive and brought them into Babylon. So Daniel has lived the vast majority of his life in this kingdom as a captive. But God has blessed him. And now, in his 80s, he is one of the 3 most powerful men in the kingdom under King Darius. And the king is about ready to promote him again. Now, if you're already one of the most powerful 3, the only one above those 3 is the king. The only way Daniel can be promoted again is to be put above the other 2 commissioners. Now, how do you think those other 2 commissioners feel about this? After all, Daniel's a foreigner. He's a Jew. And now you're going to put him over us? And believe it or not, there was a day when in politics there was envy and jealousy taking place. There was a day that happened. And it happens right here. In fact, let me keep reading in verse number 4 and 5. Look what happens. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel. Now, I know that's like, we can never imagine that happening in our society today. I know that in our politics, but back then it happened. And it says that they were trying to find an accusation in regard to the governmental affairs. Let's find a reason why he cannot be promoted. Is this sounding at all familiar to you? Isn't it amazing how not many things change over the years? Keep reading. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful. And no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. So because Daniel has nothing that they can accuse him for, they decide to come up with a trap. I know we could never imagine that happening today in politics, but back then it happened. And look at verse number 5. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Because the only thing Daniel is more loyal to than the king is his God. So we have to find a way to trap him using his own faith. And that's what they decide to do. So we see now a plot against Daniel. And in this plot, these men try to find some way, some reason that they can say to the king, you can't promote this guy. He's not worthy of the position. And they can't find anything, so they set a trap. Now notice as they're looking, notice 3 things we learn about Daniel. Number 1, we learn that Daniel was faithful in his duties as a commissioner in Persia. He was faithful, the Bible says. He did his job right. He did his job with integrity. He was faithful when it came to his duties. Not only that, we learn in that text I read that he was faultless in his character. He was faultless in his, they could not find a skeleton in his closet. They couldn't find something he had said that he should not have said, something he did that he should not have done, some secret that they could reveal. And the other thing they discovered was he was fervent in his faith. The only thing he was more loyal to than the king was his God. So they decide that's it. If we're going to set a trap, we've got to use his faith against him. We must make him walk into the trap because of his deep devotion to his God. So here's what they do. Let me keep reading now, beginning in verse number 6. It says this. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days will be cast into the lion's den. Now, by the way, they're obviously lying because all the commissioners did not come up with that. There were 3 commissioners. Daniel was one of them. He's obviously not part of that. I know it's hard for us to believe, but there was actually a time that lying took place in politics, and it does right here. Now, let's keep going in verse number 8, and notice it. It says, now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document. That is the injunction. So what happens? Daniel's enemies come up with this plot. And the plot is simple. They appeal to the king's pride and arrogance. And they say, King, you are so powerful. You are like God. In fact, you are so powerful that you should issue a law that makes you God for a month. In other words, for the next 30 days, King, no one is allowed to pray to any other god except you. You will be God for a month. And if anyone dares to pray to any god except you, let him be thrown into the lion's den. And they know that this is a law, if they can get the king to sign it, this is a law that Daniel would have to break. It's all a trap. And the king falls for being buttered up. He signs the decree. By the way, it says he signed it in the law of the Medes and the Persians. Now, in that day, here's what that meant. If something was written in the law of the Medes and the Persians, it could never be overturned. No one could overturn it for any. It's not like today where one president can issue an executive order and the next president change it. Or one Congress can make a law and the next Congress change it. That wasn't how it was back then. Once it was in, it could not be changed. And the penalty for breaking the law was capital punishment by being thrown into a den of hungry lions. And the king signs the decree. And now Daniel is in a very difficult situation. Because Daniel would be breaking the law of God to pray to King Darius. The Bible's very clear. Part of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt have no other God before me. So Daniel now has to make a choice. Do I break the law because I'm committed to God and suffered the consequences? Or do I compromise in my faith? Well, Daniel does exactly what these enemies knew he would do. He stays true to his faith. And look what happens beginning in verse number 10. Now, in verse number 10, in this one verse, I'm going to show you 8 characteristics of Daniel's prayer life from one verse. Look what it says. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house, now in his roof chamber. He had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then verse 11 says, these men, these enemies, came by agreement, found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. So from this, let me very quickly show you 8 characteristics of his prayer life. My hope and my prayer is that you will latch on to one of them, and you will apply that to your life this week to make your prayer life more fervent. Here we go. Number 1, the first thing we see is that Daniel's prayer life was a passion. It was a passion. How do we know that? Because verse 10 begins by saying, knowing that the injunction had been signed, Daniel prayed. Daniel prayed not in ignorance. He knew what was going on. He knew the law had been signed. He knew it could not be overturned. He knew what the law said. If you pray to anyone except the king for 30 days, you will be thrown into the lion's den. And knowing that, Daniel still prayed. Now, folks, if that's not passion, I don't know what is. Let me ask you a question. Here in the Gospel Center, down in the chapel, at our Sioux campus. Those watching online, you can respond by hitting the heart button. Here's the question. How many of you would honestly say, I should have prayed more this past week than I did? Would you raise your hand if you can honestly say that? I should have prayed this past week more than I did. Thank you. You can put your hands down. Let me ask you this question. What kept you from praying more this week? What kept you from praying more this week? Did you just not think about it? Was there no real crisis in your life? Were you busy watching television or doing your duties or checking Facebook or email? What kept you from praying more this past week than you did? Were any of you at risk of being thrown into a lion's den if you prayed? Isn't it amazing how it doesn't take much to make an American Christian lack prayer? Daniel had a passion. And Daniel was so passionate about praying that he was willing to do it, even if it meant his death. Daniel's prayer life was a passion. How much passion is prayer in your life? Think about that. Notice number 2. The second characteristic I see. Daniel's prayer life was done in private. It says he entered his house to pray. He did not pray at the corner of the city market. He did not pray in the middle of the palace. The Bible says he entered his house. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with corporate prayer and public prayer. You see that in the Bible. That's a good thing. However, the type of prayer that seems to be elevated the most in Scripture is that private prayer. When you go and you look through the Bible, you read through the stories of the Old Testament, every man or woman that did something great for God seemed to have something in common. And that thing was this: they spent time alone with God in prayer. In fact, you can find that with Jesus as well. He would get up very early while it was still dark and go off to a solitary place, the Bible says, and there he would pray. When Jesus taught us to pray, he said, go into your house, enter your closet, and close the door. There is something amazingly intimate, amazingly powerful about getting alone with God in prayer. And Daniel had that commitment. He was passionate about praying. He prayed in private. He made that a big thing in his life. So number 1, his prayer life had a passion. Number 2, it was done in private. Number 3, there was a purpose to it. Daniel had a purpose. It says in verse number 10, it gives us a parenthesis and says that Daniel's windows, when you open them, faced Jerusalem. Now, you couldn't see Jerusalem from Daniel's windows. Jerusalem was 1,000 miles away. So why did Daniel open the windows and pray looking towards Jerusalem? Well, here's why. Because if you were a Jew in the Old Testament and you were a worshiper of the God of Israel, where was the central place of worship of the God of Israel? It was Jerusalem. That's where it all happened. That's where ultimately the temple would be built. That's where people went several times a year for the feast. Jerusalem was the central point of the worship of the God of Israel. So here's Daniel. He has been in the land of Babylon, now Persia, for decades, since he was a teenager. 1,000 miles away from the center of the worship of his God. But even decades later, and 1,000 miles away, the purpose of his prayer life is still focused on the people of Israel, the God of Israel, and the purpose and plan of that God. And this is a way that he can keep mentally focused on the fact that his prayer life isn't about him. It's not about Persia. It's not about King Darius. It's all about the God of Israel. That's the purpose of his prayer. So Daniel's life was a passion. Daniel's life was done in prayer life was done in private. Daniel's prayer life had a purpose. Next, Daniel's prayer life was a pattern. It was a pattern because that verse says he continued to pray. That tells me this has been his pattern. This is not Daniel going, so the king made that law, I'll show him. This is not Daniel suddenly doing something out of civil disobedience that he's never done earlier. This is Daniel doing what has been his pattern. Daniel prayed as a pattern. He did not pray when it was convenient. He did not just pray when there was a crisis. Prayer was a pattern of his life. When you looked at his routine, it involved prayer. I think one of the reasons that many Christians today fail to spend time in prayer is because we haven't made it a pattern. If you're struggling to have a daily prayer life, can I suggest this to you? Make yourself a standing appointment. Every day at this time will be my prayer time. Put it into your Outlook. Ask Siri to remind you. And when somebody calls you up and says, hey, let's go get coffee, and it's at the same time you've scheduled for prayer, you tell them you already have an appointment at that time. Make prayer a pattern of your life. Daniel's prayer life was a passion. He prayed in private. He prayed with a purpose. There was a pattern in his prayer. Notice the next one. Daniel's prayer life showed his position. And I don't want to overlook this, because it says in the verse that he prayed kneeling on his knees. Now, I'm not in any way saying that that's the only appropriate body position of prayer. When you look in the Bible, you will find many different body positions in prayer. You will find people who stood and prayed, lifted their arms to heaven and prayed, laid prostrate on the ground and prayed, danced and prayed. But primarily, the number one body position you see in the Bible with people who were praying is they would kneel. Why? Because kneeling is an outward way of reminding our mind and our heart who we are and who God is. It's a way for us to acknowledge our dependence on the Almighty. And I would suggest this to you. If you're physically able, not every time you pray, but why don't you do this? One time this week, just one time. When you pray, get on your knees and see if it doesn't help you in your mindset of who you are and who God is. So Daniel's prayer life was a passion. It was done in private. It had a purpose. It was a pattern. It had a position. The next thing I see is this. Daniel's prayer life was a priority. How do we know that? Because it says in that verse that not only did he pray daily, but Daniel prayed 3 times every day. Now let me ask you a question. Think about this past week. What did you do a minimum of 3 times every day? No, don't say it out loud. But what did you do a minimum of 3 times every day this past week? Because whatever it was, I would suggest to you, if you did it at least 3 times every day, that was probably a priority for you, right? Eating, that's a priority, right? For some of us, more of a priority than others, I'm afraid. But it's a priority. When you do something at least 3 times in a day, it's a priority in your life. So let me ask you a question. Is prayer a priority in your life? What if you tried something just for 1 week? What if you took a 1-week challenge? Here it is. Now, I'm not talking the rest of your life. I'm saying 1 week. What if you said, okay, beginning tomorrow, for the next 7 days, 1 week, I will pray 3 times a day for at least 10 minutes each time, and I will let nothing stop me from doing that. What if you did that for 1 week? What if you said, I will pray 3 times a day this week for at least 10 minutes each time, and I will let nothing stop me? I mean, think about it. How many times in your day can you fit in 10 minutes? Quite a few, I would think. I wonder what would happen to your prayer life if you took the 3-time-a-day challenge for just 1 week. Daniel's prayer life was a priority. Now, the last 2 are the 2 that really stuck out to me. Here's the next one, number 7. Daniel's prayer life was full of praise. I love this because it says in the text that he prayed and gave thanks. Now, stop for a second. Let's think about Daniel's situation. How old is he? He's in his 80s. Where does he live? Persia. How long has he been there? Since he was a teenager. How did he get there? He was taken captive by force. He's been stripped away from his family and friends. He's lived his life now away from home in a strange heathen culture. And now he is surrounded by a group of political enemies. Enemies who want to destroy him. Enemies who have set what appears to be a foolproof trap. Daniel is on the verge of becoming lion food. He is on the verge of being thrown into a lion's den. Does it strike you interesting that Daniel's heart is full of thanksgiving? Isn't it amazing that even in that situation, Daniel's prayer life is filled with giving thanks to God? You see, I think Daniel had figured out something that I'm still trying to learn in my life. Daniel has learned the lesson on what it means to really trust God. Even when the bottom drops out of your life, to really trust God. And because he can trust God in the horrible situation he finds himself in, he is able in his prayer life to be full of praise. You see, all too often, we view prayer as getting from God. And that's an important element. We're told to cast our cares upon him, to tell him our needs. But I think sometimes we forget that prayer isn't just getting from God. Prayer is also giving to God. How much time did you spend this week in your prayer life just thanking God for his goodness in your life, even in the midst of hardship? How much time did you spend this week praising God in your prayer life, worshiping God, giving him adoration, speaking well of him? Because prayer isn't just getting from God. Prayer is also giving to God. And here's Daniel in a very difficult situation, and his prayer life is full of praise. And then look at number 8. Number 8, Daniel's prayer life was personal. I love this. It says he prayed before his God. Now I want you to think about this with me. Because when you look at verse number 10, there's something missing. What's missing in verse number 10? Nowhere in the verse does it tell us what Daniel asked of God. Doesn't say it at all, does it? We know he made requests, I'm sure he did, but doesn't tell us what the requests were. Did he pray for protection from the lions? Did he pray that the king would show him mercy? Did he pray that the plan would fail? Did he pray for the demise of his enemies? We don't know what he prayed for. It's not in the text. And that says something to me. And here's what it says. Listen. The focus of our prayers should not be the requests. The focus of our prayer should be the relationship. What is prayer? Prayer is not just asking from God. Yes, we're to do that, but that's not the focus of prayer. Prayer is the act of being with God. Think about it. Think about the most important human relationships in your life. How strong would that relationship be if the only time the other person ever talked to you is when they were asking you to do them a favor? If the only time your spouse ever talked to you began with the words, "Would you do me a favor?" If the only time your friend ever talked to you began with the words, "Would you do me a favor?" If the only time your kids ever talked to you, if the words began with, "Would you do me a favor?" How strong would that relationship be if the only time they ever talked to you was to ask you to do something? That wouldn't be a very strong relationship, would it? Now, it's great to ask your spouse for favors. It's great to ask your parents for favors. That's fine. That's great. But ladies and gentlemen, communication isn't about the request. Communication's about the relationship, isn't it? And shouldn't that be the same in our prayer life? Instead of focusing on just the requests, and those are important, can't we focus on the fact that we get to spend time intimately building a relationship with our God? A little over 10 years ago, I was invited to a small luncheon, just a handful of pastors, and a national Christian leader that if I mentioned his name, you would all recognize the name. And so it's a man I greatly admire, and I was excited to go and meet him and spend time in this intimate lunch, just a handful of pastors and him. And during the lunch, there was a Q&A time, and typically when I'm in those type of settings, my introvert comes out in me, and I don't say much. I just listen. But I listened, and most of the questions were issue-related. What do you think about this issue? What do you think about that issue? How would you handle this? And that was great. But I was watching the time because that afternoon was my son's last high school soccer game. So I knew I was going to have to leave early. But there was a question I wanted to ask this leader. So with about 20 minutes before I had to leave, I kind of rose my hand and introduced myself and said, before I ask my question, I want to apologize to you in advance because in about 20 minutes, I'm going to have to sneak out early because today's my son's last high school soccer game. And I will never forget how this guy responded. Literally. He just looked at me, he said, "Wait a second. Today's your son's last high school soccer game?" Yeah. This guy literally picked up his chair, brought it over towards me, sat his chair down, got on the edge of his seat, leaned forward, and said, "What's your son's name?" I told him. He said, "What position does he play?" And I told him. He said, "Tell me what it's like." I said, what's like? He said, "What's it like to know that today's your son's last high school soccer game? What's it like? Because I'm going to be there in about 2 to 3 years, depending on if my son passes this grade. I'm going to be there in about 2 to 3 years. What's it like?" And for 20 minutes, No one else said a word. No questions were asked. He and I just had this intimate conversation about what it's like to be a dad, what it's like to see your kids grow up. And I got to be honest, I can't even remember if I asked him the question or not. And if I did, I certainly don't remember the answer because I don't remember the question. But I remember when I was walking to my car, going, how cool. I mean, that's a guy I really respect. How cool is it that, like, for just 20 minutes, we had this intimate conversation about being a dad. And as I was driving to my son's soccer game, it dawned on me, wait a second. Anytime I want, every time I need, I can go to the most powerful, wise, loving, majestic, all-powerful, sovereign being in the universe. And I can talk with him. And you know what he'll do? He'll move his throne right up to me. And he'll sit on the edge of that throne. And he'll lean over and he'll say, tell me what it's like. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the focus of our prayer life should not be the requests, though those are important. The focus of our prayer life should be the relationship. And that's what Daniel had. Which of those 8 characteristics can you grab onto this morning? Which of those 8 can you say, okay, I'm going to apply this one to my life this week. I'm going to add some fervency to my prayer life. And we have a tool to help remind you. In your bulletin this morning, you'll find this really cool looking magnet. It has a picture of our Gaylord campus, our Sioux campus, church online, and our TV ministry. And we're asking you to put this magnet somewhere where you'll see it at least 3 times a day. Where you'll see this magnet at least 3 times a day. And let that be a reminder to you to pray for our ministry. Because nothing of eternal importance ever happens apart from prayer. If you're watching online, we would love to mail you one of these. Just click on the Connect card at the top of the page and fill it out. And under the portion where it says for prayer requests, put, please send me a magnet. We will get it in the mail to you. And as you pray, would you continue to pray for our in-gathering project? November 18th is our in-gathering project, and our goal this year is to be able to upgrade our stage lighting at both of our campuses and to expand our TV ministry to cover the entire Upper Peninsula for up to 3 years. And if we can raise $82,000 on In-Gathering Sunday, we can do all the lighting and cover the UP for 1 full year. If we can raise $99,000, we can cover it for 2 full years. If we can raise $116,000, we can cover it for 3 full years. If we were to raise $150,000, just saying, we could cover it for 5 full years. There's no ministry in our church that's reaching more people. It's seeing more people come to know Jesus. I preached a funeral yesterday out in the Traverse City area of a faithful TV viewer. And while I was out there, I was at Menards and had a man stop me, come up to me, recognize me, and told me what our TV ministry has meant to him and his wife. We get emails every single day. We've already received donations from our internet campus viewers and our TV viewers towards this project. It's going to be a wonderful opportunity. It's the last piece of the puzzle for us to accomplish our vision, which is to saturate all of northern Michigan with the gospel of Jesus and the teaching of the Word of God. So I encourage you, would you be praying fervently that God would allow us to meet this goal? Would you be praying, asking God to show you what He might want you to give, your best financial gift over and above your regular giving? We're excited to see how God could use this to reach the Upper Peninsula for Jesus. Well, you know how this story ends, right? Daniel does get thrown in the lion's den, yes. But God protects him. The lions don't eat him. And the next day he's brought back out. His enemies are instead thrown into the lion's den, and the lions do eat them. You can read the rest of the chapter and read the story. But I want to suggest this to you, though. I want to suggest that the real lion's den that Daniel faced was not that pit. The real lion's den Daniel faced was his prayer room. That's the real lion's den. Now, why do I say that? Well, look at 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. It's a command to us as followers of Jesus. It says this: be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring what? Lion, seeking someone to devour. Folks, do you realize that you live in the lion's den? You're in it every day. And there is an enemy, there is an adversary who, like a roaring lion, wants to devour you. He wants to devour your marriage. He wants to devour your children. He wants to devour your reputation. He wants to devour your church. The real lion's den is where we live. And that's why we need to pray. Look at these last two verses from Ephesians chapter 6. Let me just read them. Finally, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil, the lion. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against the devil and his demons, rulers, powers, forces of this darkness, spiritual forces of wickedness. And there's only one way to defeat the lion. And in verse number 18 of that same chapter, it gives it to us. Look at it. With all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, with this in view, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for all the saints. First Peter said, be on the alert. Why? Because the devil, like a lion, wants to devour you. Be on the alert because you live in the lion's den. And how are you on the, what does it mean to be on the alert? It says right there, be on the alert. How? With perseverance and petition, with prayer. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to wait till you're thrown into a lion's den to pray. You live in the lion's den. Prayer must be a fervent, essential part of your life. And nothing of eternal importance ever happens apart from prayer. Would you stand with me, please? So, Father, I thank you today that you give us this amazing opportunity to pray, to come before you, to build a relationship with you. And when we come before you, you pull your throne right up to us. You lean in and you say, tell me what it's like. Wow. And God, we need that because we live in the lion's den. We face that lion every single day. And he's vicious. And he wants to devour us. And you, God, are the only one who can shut the mouth of the lion. And that's why you tell us to be on the alert by praying for the saints. So I pray that these magnets would be a reminder to us of our need to pray fervently. In Jesus' name, amen.
Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, heart the rocks shall pray. you have a wonderful week.
Well, Daniel had quite the prayer life, didn't he? And here at E-Free Church, we really believe that nothing of eternal importance happens apart from prayer. And we would like to pray for you right now. I'm sure that you have a concern or a burden that you're dealing with. Why don't you right now click on that live prayer chat button at the bottom right of your screen. That's going to connect you into a private chat with one of our trained prayer team members. It's very confidential. Tell them your concern. They'll pray for you right now in that live prayer chat. Now, we also talked today about magnets, and we would love to get you one of those magnets that has our main ministries on it, including Church Online, as a reminder to be praying fervently for our church and our ministry. It's free. To get that magnet, you can do one of two things. First, you can hit the connect button at the top of your screen, fill out that connect card, and where it asks you for a prayer request, type in you'd like a magnet. We'll mail one out to you this week. Or you can just email us at churchonline@myefree.org. That's MIEFREE.org. Let us get that magnet out to you so you have that reminder to be praying for your ministry as well. I also want to encourage you to be part of our Facebook group, because that's the way we're able to communicate with you on a regular basis. It's simple. Just click on the banner at the bottom of your screen, and that will take you to the page where you can join our Facebook group for Church Online. Now, next Sunday, we're going to continue our series, Because I Love My Church, by looking at this topic. Because I love my church, I will love radically. I hope you'll tell someone else about Church Online. Invite them to join us next Sunday. And we're going to keep our chat at the right side of your screen open for a while. So why don't you right now join the conversation? If you haven't told us yet where you're watching from, we'd love to have you do that right now. I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday right here.